Okay, nice to meet you. Wow, what a
Very nice
library
to meet you.
behind you.
Very nice to meet you. Hey, Alexey, good to see you.
Hi, Mike.
Good to meet you. We were just talking about how to carry this on or can make connections.
Mm, mm.
So Alexei had some ideas.
Please, yeah.
Should we maybe, say a few words, maybe Frank, about who you are? Because
Well,
I'm so grateful that the two of you are talking. You're highly influential in each of your respective fields. You're both polyscientists. Frank is one of the few kind of, renowned psychologists who is brave enough to use nonlinear dynamical systems, computer modeling, and so you can speak the
Fabulous.
same language, which I'm very excited about. But
Fabulous.
okay. All right. So I'm actually a psychiatrist, but I also had a degree in what would be called neuroscience today. It was more neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, working on actually invertebrates. I love those creatures. I ended up with cockroaches, which horrifies some people. But they're fantastic critters, kinds of things. And so there's really a couple of pathways I've been going down, which, I see the connections. Most people don't, but one of them is looking at a particular disorder called dissociative disorders, the multiple personality disorders, but really generalizing that to a set of disorders characterized by rapid transitions in mental state. And so that bipolar orders in there, panic attacks are in there, catatonia is in there, flashbacks are in there. There's a whole series of really psychiatric disorders in which one of the primary issues is a very rapid transition from one state of mind into another state of mind. And so I'm interested in what constitutes states, particularly in the process of transitioning from one state to another. So I'm interested in the disorder. I'm interested in what I see as a larger set of dynamics that are applicable to other disorders and probably represent a place of clinical leverage. If we could control switching, we could switch people out of depression. We could switch people out of mania. We could block panic attacks. We could do a lot of these things much more readily. The other thing, based on what I work based on that work, I transitioned a lot to children. And partly because my work with the adults told me that they'd been this way since children and that it wasn't really possible to sort of retrospectively figure out how they developed into kind of what I would call an us rather than an I, that is the degree of unification in the personality. And so, in that context, I saw a lot of what I felt were biological changes in these children. And I created a study it started officially in 1987, still goes on. It's kind of encompassed three generations, looking at sort of the biological effects of very serious child abuse. Basically, we chose incest, which, kind of hits at the relationship level. Typically, there's a huge number of episodes. It's not simply a molestation by a stranger, but by a family member who's living there. So it's a real hit, and have been following a sample all these years and looking at them first biologically and looking at the HPG axis, HPA axis, looking at cognitive development in the sample, looking at a number of different things, came to the conclusion that we were looking at an accelerated aging process, and that now with the epigenetic work on looking at epigenetic age acceleration, we really sort of nailed that. Plus now other people we had this kind of prospectively, longitudinally, we could see that they peaked out cognitively much earlier than our control sample. They had sort of lower attainment levels. Their HPA axis went through this transition. much faster. Their HPG axis was accelerated. They came into puberty about a year earlier than our matched controls, which is a big thing developmentally. It has a lot to do. These are all girls, by the way. I'm sorry to say that this was a group of incestuously abused girls. And then we've seen their children, and we actually also followed prospectively their mothers, got retrospective histories on their mothers, and then sort of prospectively. So we had kind of three generations. And so I'm also interested in intergenerational transmission of risk, and because you just see it just huge, that these families just have, trains of abuse going back generation after generation after generation. And that's actually something I'm trying to take on with computer modeling, because you can't, do that experiment really if you think about it. But we have about 20 things that we can identify as factors for intergenerational transmission. And so using sort of agent-based modeling kinds of attacks, I'm interested in seeing what if I can figure out what are the real pivotal issues here, and what are the essentially the tipping points that lead to transmission across generations, or at least increase risk for transmission across generations. It's kind of a crazy sort of problem, but I don't see another way to sort of approach it. So I have those sorts of issues. In between, I also for about 12 years, ran a forensic center that evaluated children, and I followed them and their families, but actually did the forensic evaluations, involved testifying in court, dealing with all the legal issues. And I had a fairly large scale prevention program. This was in the city of Cincinnati, where I did a sort of maternal intervention aimed at helping the children. So that's kind of a sweep of the different kinds of issues. For me, they're all kind of part of the same problem, but people can't say, what do states have to do with prevention of child abuse? Kind of. So that's a short story, I guess.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, many things to talk about, and I'll tell you kind of the big picture of what we do. But I just wanted to, because you brought it up, I wanted to say one interesting thing that is brand new out of our lab that you may not have seen yet, regarding to aging, to what you said about aging. So it turns out that in normal human patients, if there is such a thing, if you look at the gene expression that they have, young versus older, one of the things that we find is during aging is a dissociation of the phylogenetic age of the genes that they are expressing. And what I mean by that is younger tissues, all of the different organs are in pretty tight agreement about where on the tree of life most of your genes should be. So there's this technique called phylostratigraphy, which tells you for any given gene, roughly how old it is, right, across the tree of life. So if you look at young tissues, all of the tissues in the body are basically concordant with respect to the age of the genes that they're expressing. During age, the different organs start to float away from each other. They start to dissociate, and they start to express differently across the tree of life, including some of them go backwards, right? Traverse the evolutionary history backwards towards more primitive genes. But what you find, which I think is to me quite interesting with respect to what you study, is the loss of concordance. They are no longer in agreement. There's not just one story about where we are on the tree of life, but there are multiple stories. And how much of the aging phenotype is actually a consequence of the fact that you are now, I don't know if they're switching. We don't know that, but what we do know is that you now have different regions in the body that are no longer in agreement about what the age of their gene should be, and I think
that's very interesting.
Isn't that wild? So we study, I mean, for years we've been studying the spatial dissociation of cancer. So cancer in many ways is a disease of spatial dissociation. I mean, I call it a somatic dissociative disorder because what happens literally is that cells disconnect from the electrical network that keeps all of the cells focused on building and maintaining specific things. So they have this large scale pattern memory, whether it be a heart or a liver or whatever they're working on. Individual cells disconnect from that, and they can no longer remember that goal. And now they're just amoebas in the environment, and they do what single cell organisms do. And we've developed a kind of integration approach where we don't kill the cells, we don't fix the genetic mutations if they have them. What we do is we reconnect them to forcibly reconnect them to the electrical network, and they rejoin and they start doing normal things and behaving normally, and they stop making tumors and that kind of thing. But whereas cancer is that kind of dissociation in space, it now starts to look like aging, like human aging is a dissociation in time, specifically in evolutionary time. And so I think this issue of, I think this is why Alexey brought us together. This issue of dissociation and reassociation and switching has profound consequences across scales. Not just cognitively, but somatically and biomedically as well.
Yeah, I know. That's certainly one of the places I felt that there was a connection there. So they were sort of on very different scales. Planaria versus people.
Yeah. So overall, that's what I study. I want to understand how very diverse kinds of minds come to be, how they scale up, how parts become integrated. So cognitive glue mechanisms. How do parts, and this might be cells, and they might be neurons, as in your case, or they might be other kinds of cells, as in my case, form collectives that are dominated by specific thought patterns that make them more than the sum of their parts. And we see this. And so what I like to do is steal tools from the cognitive behavioral science community and the neuroscientists and apply them widely. First, in other kinds of cells, that's almost trivial because that is where the mechanisms are all homologous. That is where the brain evolved all of its cool mental tricks, is by pivoting them from anatomical spaces that have been navigated since the beginning of multicellularity and actually bacterial biofilms even. But we also apply them to some other really weird things that are not cells. So that's what I'm interested in, is learning to detect unfamiliar minds in weird embodiments, and trying to understand the scaling process by which they dissociate and associate in the first place.
Very, very interesting. I thought your papers were very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
The cognitive glue paper, I read that several times. I had a little more trouble with the thoughts and the thinkers, but I really liked the cognitive glue. I thought that was extraordinary. The experiments were just amazing to me, actually.
Would it be okay if I try to share a very brief kind of attempt to integrate your work, Michael?
Go for it. Go for it.
So I was thinking, Michael, to start with your hypothesis that, if we take development first, development is active. There is a morphogenic goal set up. And to me, during development, it's a very active phase. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of construction to make. And in that sense, the system is hopeful, optimistic. It's hopeful to reach the goal. And you have this measure in your paper with Leo, active information storage, which simply means that during development, there's much data transfer from the past to the present. We use our memories quite a bit, and we use them to move toward the goal in the future. What that means is that temporal depth is significant. Your light cone is present during development, right? And then when the goal is accomplished, let's say adulthood, or the certain organ is built, then from that point forward, there's not much future. The future is predicted to be the same. And there's no need to use the memory systems much. There's no construction going on. So the temporal depth collapses. The temporal light cone is shrinking in that point. And conversely, this could be seen as the onset of aging, if you wish. I just wanted to put it out there that the word you used, it's a morphogenic dissociation in that sense, that the temporal depth collapses when the aging starts, because the goal is reached. This is why reaching the goal is happening. And then if you do your cure of regenerative work, let's say regeneration of a limb, the new goal shows up. There's again a planning for the future. There's again the use of the past, and the system is again hopeful. So then I just want to put the time parameter there explicitly. And to go to Frank's work now with, let's say, complex PTSD, right? Now the scale is different. Your work is cells, tissues, organs, right? Frank's work is the entire person, and perhaps over longer time scales, like several generations. But if we take complex PTSD, which briefly is prolonged unbearable stress in circumstances when there's no escape and repeated trauma, then we can say that sometimes the person becomes resigned, saying there's nothing to do, which we call helplessness, and nobody's coming in to help, right? And there's no more goals because there's nothing to do. It's helpless. And also there's no future. The person is extremely pessimistic, if not depressed and dysphoric. The only prediction is the pain and suffering will continue, but nothing good is predicted, right? And in that sense, there's no goals in the future. There's just perpetuation of suffering, and the extreme form of that is suicidality, saying that the only way to resolve it is destructive. What I'm saying is that state of resignment is also the collapse of the temporal goal. There is no future, and there's no need for use the past. The only prediction is that. So there's some similarity in that sense. Now, in therapy, many things happen, and Frank helped us so much with Bethany Brand's work and Ruth Lenius of sort of finding common ground. But one of the small components of therapy at some point in the middle maybe is installation of hope. The hope comes back. There's something to live for, as Nietzsche said, right? And the third perspective is free energy principle, which I think complements your work nicely, because FEP, I think, is about maintenance. After you've reached the goal, the morphostasis, the maintenance of the shape is FEP. And FEP has optimism bias. The FEP system predicts to remain, and it does certain things to do so. It perceives the world, builds the model of the world, and it acts upon the world to continue persisting. So in that sense, it's optimistic. Now, there's forces of nature that are trying to decay the FEP system, and for different reasons. So there's sort of stress on the boundary, on the Markov blanket, and the nature wants the system to stop. But then we need energy to maintain the system. Morphostasis takes energy. As Chris Fields succinctly says, it takes energy to reduce uncertainty. So in FEP, it takes energy to reduce uncertainty, whether I'll live or I'll die.
No glare here. I'm just mask out here.
Yeah.
The sun coming in our upper window here.
I feel optimistic from this sun. I love it. But, so then, again, to go back, aging can be seen as a gradual withdrawal of energy from this force of maintenance. Under FEP, we have two forces. The dissipative force, the decay, is called gradient flow, and the one that maintains life is called the solenoidal flow. So when aging starts and the energy is gradually decreased from the force that maintains the system structure, then it starts decaying gradually. And that can be a description of aging from the FEP standpoint. And I'll probably stop talking at this point, but I don't know if that's how that sounds to both of you.
Well, as I say, I keep feeling there are places where we sort of crisscross, but it's at such different scales. As when we talked on the phone, I was very interested in this idea of your temporal collapse, and particularly what aspects of dissociation you felt emerged from that process. I had a sense that you felt that temporal collapse brought on dissociation. Is that correct? That the dissociation, as we understand it clinically, the sort of outside of the body and the sense of multiple separate selves and the amnesias, those symptoms emerge out of the temporal collapse, or does it?
Our hypothesis, and I think we're working on, just building the model in silico and seeing what happens in a computer modeling. But the idea there, Frank, was that the continuation of self in time requires a temporal depth, meaning I am the same as I have been, and I predict to be the same Alexey in the future. Now, when that collapses and I live in the here and now of the few seconds or a few minutes or whatever, and there's no temporal depth, then essentially there is no continuity of self. It's discontinuous. So the only thing we're saying is that temporal depth is a prerequisite for coherence of the self. Is one of the arguments in the paper, that without it, it's pretty impossible to maintain the coherence, if it makes any sense.
So it is really different than what I'm thinking about. What's one of the striking features of dissociation is amnesias. And they're usually autobiographical amnesias. That is, people cannot remember um, parts of their personal history. And so they don't feel connected to that flow of history that is part of what is provides continuity in a sense of self. That is across time, is that you reach back and you feel like you're the same person you were yesterday because you have a continuity of memories, not because your DNA has changed or your fingerprints have changed or something. So that amount of ability to sort of reach past memories and to some extent future aspirations, say, is state dependent. And so in different mental states, so a manic person will tell you very different things about their past and their future and the present than the same person when they're depressed. They have their associations are very different, even though the history is common across them. And so one of the things you see in different states is, and we're talking about a disorder that's characterized by a lot of different states. That is, when you're dealing with somebody who has multiple personality, they have half a dozen or more sort of fairly discrete states. And they're discrete not only sort of psychologically, but actually biologically. But that's not so surprising given that, if you look at somebody who's the same person depressed and the same person manic, they're physiologically different also. Um, and so, and if you look at the same person having a panic attack versus in a euthymic state, they're physiologically different. So states have a physiological difference. And somebody who is switching states a lot, as these people switch states, has sort of a lot of discrete physiological differences, but also cognitive differences, particularly in terms of ability to access past knowledge, history, both. And so you'll find some of them who are completely past focused. That is, they are living in the past. They have a different body image of themselves, that they think they're a child or they think they're at a different age. And then you have others who think that they're at some other kind of age. So you have this kind of temporal sort of series of, I don't know, contemporary compartmentalizations in these people. And that shows up as amnesias for past experiences so that they don't remember doing things that they were witness doing and that sort of thing. And that is a function of the different dissociative states. We can go in and give cognitive measures and see those differences in the individual in terms of their cognitive attainment, what they can do, what information they can retrieve. We can give one personality a list of words and another personality a list of words that are very similar but different, like sofa and couch or lamp and light or something like that, and look at crossover, how much interference is there across, and some of them are very, very able to keep this information very, very separate. And whereas our control subjects, the information gets all confused. And they can't pick out which list a word came from, and they can't give you words on list A versus list B. So there is this sort of state compartmentalization cognitively. There's kind of a physiology that's pretty replicable across different states. We would measure most of our subjects multiple times across multiple days and see that that not the different states or personality states were pretty coherent within themselves, but across time, across states, there was a lot of difference. But there were certain places where there were connections. One, more at what I'd call the autonomic nervous system level, things like habituation to startle. So if you habituated one personality, that habituation carried across the other personalities if you to startle. So there were certainly connectivity also. They were not separate, entirely separate. There were levels of connectivity, even though their subjective experience is very much as if they were separate people. I mean, and they're adamant about that. I had this experience of talking to a subject I saw in 1981. Okay, he's now like 90 years old, and he hunted me down and wanted to talk about the study he was in with me. And one, he was remarkably consistent. You know, I'd seen him, you know, 30, 40 years ago. And as I met again, his personalities, Philip, Luther, um, one called Legion, who's his angry personality. Um, it was like, wow, they're just the same as they were 40 years ago. The other thing is he's kind of remarkable because he's still alive at 90. Most of these people don't make it past about 65 or so. They're very much, I think, because what we're seeing with this accelerated aging is that they make it to about 60, 65, and then there's just this massive die-off. That's because they're developing all these common causes of death, but at much earlier ages. This is one of the consequences of the earlier accelerated aging in them is, and you see that in sort of epidemiological studies of people who have these histories that there's a big dropout in your population. It's around 60, 65 for that. And some of the studies show that that these very serious early childhood experiences take about 20 years off your life. So they really are examples of this accelerated aging and its consequences. Now we're just beginning to tap that, I think. But I'm very excited about these epigenetic tools that are coming out in terms of providing us with biomarkers to look at the effects of trauma. And what we see in the very limited data we have is, and I would stress that, is that the traumatic experiences happening in childhood seem to be much more associated with subsequent accelerated aging than traumatic experiences that happen in adulthood, kinds of things. So that in that developmental period, that seems to be, and all the children who looked at so far have, who in childhood have this epigenetic aging and acceleration effect, whereas not all the adults have that kind of thing. But the ones who have it are more likely to have had trauma in childhood. So
Super interesting. I have a question, and then I want to comment on what Alexey had said. My question is this: in these patients, are the different personalities? How shall I ask this? Do they have similar cognitive power? And what I mean by that is, do you get the sense that the sum total of cognitive performance that a given volume of the human brain can put forth, is there an issue that an interesting question about how do you support multiple such things on the same hardware, right? You see what I'm getting at? In other words, you would think that, and I know there are other reasons to not think this, but the naive assumption is that there is some degree of cognitive performance that a given volume of substrate can manage, and suddenly you're running multiple humans in the same amount. Is that an issue, or do you feel that each one of them is then diminished so that the sum total is basically preserved?
So really an essential question. Actually, what you do see is compartmentalization of certain functions. So I've had a number of extraordinary performers come through, and in certain personality states, they were capable of really extraordinary kind of cognitive functions. In other personality states, that was not available to them. Kind of thing. And one of them was a student at Harvard who I had completely independent verification from a professor about her. He came and asked me about her. She was in law school, and she was also getting a degree in philosophy. And she could write with both her hands in her legal state. And of course, he said it was driving the other students nuts. because she was taking two streams of independent thoughts off lectures. And he said they were a very competitive bunch. And the idea that this fellow student was taking two sets of notes that were different was but that was confined to a particular altered state. Now, she also had really remarkable photographic memory. I took her down to the stacks of the National Library of Medicine, and I would pull a book off the shelves, open it to a page. She could look at it for a minute, and she could read it back verbatim. It was extraordinary, and I certainly have seen this. Certain alters having sort of idiot savant level kinds of functions that were very kind of narrowly associated with these different sorts of states. And then the same one woman had a child state called Missy. And Missy was just a little tiny little child curled up in a ball and would speak in this little tiny whisper and really couldn't sort of participate in many of our studies, kinds of things. It's not as if they all necessarily add up to one single unified sense of self. There are a series of preserved abilities that are very sort of compartmentalized in them, and they excuse me for they adapt to the world by developing personalities that handle functions that they can't handle in other states. And so it gets to be kind of highly refined in some of these people, where there'll be one who puts gas in the car, and that's the mechanic. And that's all that sort of state comes out for, is that it's triggered by the need to fill up the car. And so that state comes out, kind of thing. So the capacity is in there somewhere, but it isn't generalizable. It's very compartmentalized. I mean, I think, and so one of the consequences for them in behaviorally is they can't learn well from experience, because the experience and the consequences are often quite separated. And so they end up being very perseverative and making the same mistakes over and over and over again, kinds of things, and they can't use what they know. It's a kind of a metacognitive deal for them.
Amazing. Do the individual personalities ever express a resistance to any kind of integration? Do they have some kind of a self-preservation quality where they don't want to disappear into a larger integrated personality?
Yes, yeah. In fact, that's probably the norm, that they interested in preserving the individuality intact. And so clinically, you're not trying to integrate them, whatever that is. If you're trying to develop more harmony, more internal communication, and sometimes that needs to pass through some sort of outside process. So I had a technique I call the bulletin board, where they left each other notes on the refrigerator, for example. And that's how they began to break down some of those cognitive barriers. And they'll talk about having meetings together in which different ones participate and contribute to kind of and that's sort of where you want to go clinically, is increase the internal harmony, not so much force them to be one. But they're very afraid of that, actually, afraid that you're going to get rid of the others, which you can't do, but that's their perception, that you're going to get rid of some and keep others.
I mean, it's an interesting, both that and the thing that Alexey was talking about has potentially, it's a very direct suggestions, I think, for therapeutics both on the cancer side in this case and on the regenerative side for the things that Alexey was talking about. Because the thing about the bulletin board, I mean, this is a stigmergy that the cells use all the time, and patterns in the body use all the time to leave messages for each other. And I wonder if the cancer therapeutics that we were using, where we do actually forcibly integrate them, whether that's too much of a sledgehammer, and that listening to what you just said, maybe the limitation of that is going to be the resistance And then instead of that, what we should be going for is to augment the stigmergy between them so that they can communicate, but are not, reduce that threat of that they're going to be wiped out. I mean, we as as the clinician, you want to wipe it out in that case, but maybe you don't go in there with a therapeutic that is super obvious about it. And maybe we got to do it slightly differently. The thing with what Alexey said about the future, hope and the collapse of the future and all that, also very interesting in terms of both aging and regeneration. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that in some organisms like us, the vast majority of our cells do not believe that they're going to be able to regenerate, and thus they don't. And it would be I've thought about different ways to affect that prior. Like one of the things we found that helps is if you so for the leg regeneration work, what we do is after amputating the limb, you put on this wearable bioreactor. So it's this thing that provides an enclosed aqueous environment for the wound, and then you can put in various payloads like ion channel drugs and things that try to induce specific morphogenetic events. But even an empty biodome helps. An empty biodome that has nothing in it, no payload at all, is already somewhat inducive of regeneration, I think, because it provides for the cells evidence that they can impact their environment. If you're out in dry air as a mammal, or if you're in a giant bucket of water as a frog, everything you do not have the ability to establish properties of your microenvironment. You have no control over your microenvironment in those scenarios. But if you have a protected aqueous small volume environment, you can. So by putting autocrine signals out there, you can say, hey, wait, I did increase the pH of the medium, or I did increase the amount of sodium or BMP or whatever it's going to be. And so even that is already, by giving them a little bit of control over their microenvironment, because that's a major puzzle that everybody says, well, why does the empty biodome work? That shouldn't be. I actually think that's maybe one of the key parts of this is to convince the cells that there actually is a future here, that they're not just waving out in the wind as an animal would be in the wild that gets their leg bitten off. You're going to be trying to step on it, grinding it into the forest floor. You're not going to regenerate anything under those circumstances. It's not safe, and it's in fact foolish to put energy into trying, because whatever you try to grow is not going to work. But maybe that biodome, and I've also been thinking about and I'm not an expert on this part, but some kind of plastogens, psychedelics that try to kind of enlarge basically increase the plasticity of and reduce the certainty of your priors, right? You as a mammal, as a mammalian limb, you have very strong priors that you're never going to be able to regenerate. Your liver doesn't share those priors for some reason, but your limbs do. And so and deer antlers don't share them either, right? So bone, there you've got bone vasculature, innervation, skin. Every year you make a centimeter of new bone per day when they're regenerating these things. I mean, it's insane. And so
that's an amazing process, and the nerve innervation, and that is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Well, let me react to that. Because here's where I do see, first of all, where you do see integration is spontaneous. That is, you've broken down the barriers in some way between these different states or personalities. It's the language there is always a little tricky. And that they're better able to share information and particularly retrospective memory. And that's where the trauma comes in often, that trauma is very encapsulated. And so what you often are faced with a clinician is they come in and they say, Tanya and Tom have joined, and they're Tanya or something like that. And so rather than trying to force this, which is what happened in the field very early on, when people were using these hypnotic ceremonies and rituals trying to fuse these things together, it's more likely to happen spontaneously. Now, that bio, compartment that you're talking about, what the patients do is they create that for themselves. And that for the different personalities, if you go to their house you'll see that house is not set up in some sort of continuous linear way for, like an adult to trim. It's set up in little areas. And this is Tanya's area and Tom's area and this sort of thing. So it's very compartmentalized. And when those states come out, and they often come out in some very regular way in the spontaneous world, we've done things like put beepers on them and beeped them at different times and said what's going on and what personality is out and that sort of thing. And we find that they're very different than they are in the office. So what you see in your office is not necessarily what that person is living in the world in terms of the frequency of the altered personalities. But they create different spaces for themselves where they can go off and be kind of by themselves, and that enlarges, and part of that integration process is that Tom and Tanya will merge their spaces. And so that they feel comfortable that way also. So you see this process going on and to some extent being acted out in their environment.
Amazing.
Was it-
Yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
Sorry, what?
No, please finish your thought.
No, I was just saying, I'm looking at my reflection and the sun is angle is just wiping me out.
It looks like you're about to be kidnapped by aliens.
Oh!
The beam is coming. It's very interesting about these areas and merging the areas. Like we see this kind of thing where these dynamic patterns battle for real estate in the body, and they compete, and sometimes they merge and sometimes they integrate and sometimes they don't, and they set up boundaries between them. And like if we induce, using ion channel expression, a specific bioelectric state in a region, and that specific bioelectric state is the thing that generates eye formation. It's what triggers eye formation in our face. You can make ectopic eyes anywhere in the body, but what often happens is there's this battle between the pattern that you've induced that says to all the cells, even the ones you didn't touch. They say they it's a group effect. So if I manipulate 30 cells, they will get hundreds of their neighbors to help build this eye. But the neighbors are resisting at the same time because there's a different pattern that it says, no, we should be gut or we should be skin. And those two patterns have to fight it out. And sometimes they establish a border. I'm going to be this, you're going to be that. And they settle down and that's it. And then sometimes they integrate and they make other things that are neither of those two things, or sort of a combination. And sometimes one wins or the other one wins. So for example, you often see we have these transgenic animals that light up with the early eye gene, RIX1. And so we can inject our thing. We see, oh, this thing's going to have 8 different eyes because there are 8 different spots of RIX1 coming on. And it comes on and it starts making the eye. And then the other cells around it, as actually, I think it's part of the cancer suppression mechanism, they actually convince the cells, you don't want to do this. We're going to be skin. And they basically, in the way it's mediated by electrical synapses, by gap junctions that enable the local voltage to take over. And they just acquire, let's say, a skin pattern, and they go away. Or sometimes the eye is strong enough to establish, no, I'm going to we're gonna be an eye, and here's the limits of it, and you guys can be skin outside of that, and then that's it. And you can see this, and you can potentiate one way or the other by manipulating the voltage, by manipulating the communication through gap junctions. And it's this battle of you can say personalities, but morphogenetic worldviews about how are we going to go into the future? Are we going to go as an eye or as skin, or what are we going to do?
I had a reaction, Michael.
Go
ahead, Frank.
I just was saying, I thought those eye experiments were extraordinary, and that they were functional. It was just amazing to me.
Yeah.
What you said about the empty container that promotes regeneration, we have a direct analog of that in psychotherapy. In fact, the word container is used, but if we take developmental analogy, then, the 3-year-old starts exploring, or even younger child, crawling to different corners when there's a safe base, mom's lap. When the child doesn't have a safe base, they explore less. So, and what we sometimes do in therapy, what is one of the components of therapeutic alliance is to create the safe space to which the sort of patient grows into, as opposed to forcing them or telling them, nudging, whatever. And so that is sort of very resonant to what you said. When it's perceived that this space in the relationship, the dyadic space is safe, then the growth starts. So
Yeah, I would
Fascinating.
agree with that. Creating a therapeutic space is really a critical piece, and
Amazing.
that safety is probably the central piece of that. If you can establish they feel safe, then you can deal with a lot of other issues. Yeah, and I think that the thing that I would stress in a way about the trauma here is I'm very much struck by the data that we and others have about attachment, and a particular form of attachment called type D attachment, which is very disruptive. People call it disordered dissociative attachment, is highly correlated with later developing just high levels of dissociation, pathological levels usually of dissociation. There are 2 or 3 longitudinal studies that have started out classifying infants and then ended up, looking at adults. And so those have basically all found that infants and toddlers classified as highly type D attachment end up with, as adults, with the higher levels of dissociation. So the question, and what we know is that the parenting practices there are harsh, abusive kinds of, and you see some studies as much as 80% of really maltreated children will have a type D attachment or attachment disturbance. And they're very different, clearly, from the ABC type classifications that came before. So how does that trauma impact these kids? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with safety and creating a safe sense and kind of internalizing someplace I can go where I feel safe. But it also has to do with the fact that the parents aren't teaching the generalization of information across states. I think parents very much, good parenting very much involves helping the child understand that a lot of principles cross your different states. And so, and also having to address the idea that certain states are appropriate in certain situations and not appropriate in others. So you have one state in a sort of a religious situation and another state when you're in a football stadium. And that these are different ways of being and sort of different senses of self that go along with it, and identification with different sort of processes, whether it's your religion or it's your favorite team, kind of thing. And when is it appropriate to be going, go this, go that, versus, and what we see is that that's not going on with these kids. So they're kind of left on their own to develop their sort of set of states, and nobody's attempting to integrate across those states to say, remember what we learned here, well, you can apply that there. This is part of that cause and effect deal. And so I think there's a tendency, I think, in general for kids to play a lot with personality. You think about doll play or super figure play or dress up or pretend play. It has a lot to do with identity and personality and role kinds of things. And so you can be a cowboy, or you can be an astronaut, or you can be the rock star, or whatever. But you develop kind of these sorts of states. And so I think that's a normal process that gets recruited by these kids under these circumstances to help them cope with this. And so they don't have stable senses of self that generalize very well.
Yeah, I think going forward, it would be very helpful to just ideate back and forth later about mapping all of the things you guys know about how to provide those kind of that kind of evidence, right? Evidence of being a safe space, evidence that you have control over your environment, all that kind of stuff, and how to remap it into things that we can do for cells, Obviously, the cell collectives don't have the same level or the same kind of intelligence as these kids do. But I think the basic principles are there. I think we're going to have to, it's the same message that we're trying to get across. And so it would be interesting. I mean, the most obvious thing we've done, which is to put an empty biodome on and say, look, here's your confined environment where where you have there's more control over the chemical milieu and not, and you're protected and all of that. Just to think about what else could happen, what else could we do. For example, here's something we could do. I don't know how you guys feel about this. The basic active inference thing, that predictable patterns are less stressful than random patterns. One could imagine within that biodome providing some kind of a predictable stimulus that's completely non-specific. It by itself does nothing for regeneration, but it has the feature that it is predictable and reliable, right? And we found that actually our recent work found that even algae like this. So algae can tell the difference. They get stressed out by unpredictability, and they don't like it. They move away. They want a predictable, light source, even if it's not any more light than the random one. They just like that predictability. And so maybe even something like that. I don't know. I'm pulling at straws here, but
I agree with that. I mean, this is for me one of the big issues trying to treat these kids. So many of the kids I see are in residential treatment. And so you're in this big kind of group space where you've got 3 shifts of staff, and they're reacting to these kids in different ways. And so the same behavior in the kid can elicit very different responses from the staff. And so you're creating a very unpredictable environment for these kids, which is very hard for them to make sense of or get better. And so much of the work has to do with working with the staff and saying, yes, I know the kid, you've gone over these rules 5 times with this kid, but I want you to do it again. And continually be constant in terms of responses and predictable, and be willing to go back and back and back and back over these things, because the kids don't have this good cause and effect learning, because the consequences and behavior are often separated, state dependent for them. And so creating predictability is like a major, major deal in treating these kids. And that's one of the things, like, it's easier to do with foster parents or adoptive parents, but even they screw up all the time, and just react. I've told you 10 times to do this or whatever. But that's very important in terms of creating safety for these kids. So, and I think that's kind of a biodome in a way. It's psychodome maybe.
Add to what Frank just said, Michael, when Frank mentioned type D attachment, it's called disorganized, meaning the child has no idea what's coming. They cannot rely on a parent and a parent's predictable state of behavior. And so when the parent leaves, they don't know if they need to cry, and that reliably brings the parent down, or so they don't have a style of how to deal with that separation, which is a huge stress. But, I wanted to ask you both also on a different scale of things, from Frank, your paper, and your work, Michael, where chronic stress early on in childhood, because Frank, you wrote that in these DID cases, there's hypercortisol initially, but then it balances out to hypocortisol in adulthood. So if we look at the period of chronic stress in childhood, there's chronic inflammation, immunosuppression, microglial dystrophy perhaps, but the question is, will it bring reduction in plasticity? Because if chronic stress results in reduction in plasticity, this could be a very concrete level for the onset of aging or acceleration of aging.
Yeah, now that's not just in those data that we have come out of abused kids, of which some subset of them are fairly dissociative, but it's not sort of exactly specific for dissociation. But we do see this, what we call attenuation curve. Where they start out higher than our controls, and then they, over adolescence, drop down. And that is associated with certain biological consequences, one of which is that morbid obesity. We just see them, they're just like taking off at age 18. They're heavier as a group than 75% of their peers. And their curve is just going like this, and our controls are just tracking 50th percentile kind of thing. And it's also showing up in some of the epigenetic stuff. And now I've seen other studies that have to do with sort of cortisol, hypocortisolism, and accelerated aging. So it looks like there is some sort of a mechanism there that can be teased out. And certainly cortisol, we know from a lot of studies that it damages the brain. And we know that that in abused kids, we typically see a lot of areas of the brain that are in animal studies damaged by hypercortisolemia are smaller in abused kids. And so, you know, we have reason to believe that the cortisol has also those kinds of effects.
Amazing. Super interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've taken a bunch of notes. I learned a lot. This has been great. Thank you. Let me ponder some more, and I think I'm gonna I'll come back with some much more specific questions. But we should really think about this. I think there's some really good stuff here for aspects of regenerative medicine that are basically stuck. And I think some of this is I think the missing piece.
Okay, well, very good. I've enjoyed it very much. I really liked your papers. I thought
Thank you so
it
much.
really opened my eyes in a number of areas. I really haven't thought about morphogenesis as being this powerful process in the same way.
Yeah.
That you really make a strong argument for it. I thought the experiments were really remarkable. I love the kidney tubules and how they
Amazing,
maintain the same diameter
Yeah.
down single cell.
Yeah.
Right.
Amazing. Yeah, I think the whole thing now if I had to define development, I would say it's sense making. You get some prompts from your genome, and that's great, but the fundamental of the process is it's creative sense making in real time. That just most of the time it looks like it has the same outcome, but it really doesn't have to. And I think we can learn a lot from the things that you guys are studying. So